You know, when you set out with the goal of talking about cool PS2 games with awful final bosses, they never tell you how much legal information you're gonna have to know to do it. I've covered quite a few different legal cases in my time, just trying to talk about Sonic. From the Yuji Naka vs. Square Enix case when he was removed from Balan Wonderworld, to 4Kids vs. TC Digital Media, where I learned that if you lie on the internet for long enough, it kinda just becomes the truth. I'm planning on starting a rumor that I'm wearing a hat. As video games have become a pillar of the entertainment industry, like movies, books, and music, it was obvious that they would soon become victim to the same sort of legal battles as all those other mediums. Today, we're talking about video game lawsuits. While I was mostly looking for conclusively finished lawsuits, I do want to give a quick mention to the currently ongoing lawsuit between Matthew Cassell and Alan Liu against Ubisoft for their closure of the 2014 racing game, The Crew. The two are alleging that by discontinuing the game and locking out access despite owning physical copies, that Ubisoft falsely represented the nature of the sale, and compared it to a pinball manufacturer taking away the paddles years after you purchase the machine. As somebody who knows a thing or two, or three, about games you can't buy anymore, this is a case I've had my eye on since it could set legal precedent for required preservation of digital games, and that would put me out of a job, so I'm hoping they lose. The first video game company to file a lawsuit would be Magnavox in 1974, when Atari announced plans to release a table tennis-style game called Pong. Alan Alcorn's Pong was a modified version of Ralph Baer's original table tennis game. The only reason Alan did the game was because Nolan Bushnell wanted to test his abilities now that he had joined Atari. Upon seeing the improvements he would make to the base game, they decided to instead release it as a full game. Magnavox and Ralph Baer, who owned the patent rights to the technology that made Pong possible, said, "The fuck you are," and very quickly took Atari to court. That would earn them $1.5 million, while Atari got to keep the rights to publish more Pong. Lawsuits would actually become Magnavox's main moneymaker over the next few years, as despite being the world's first video game console, the Odyssey wasn't really a breakout hit, seeing as it was only available in Magnavox stores and built into Magnavox TVs. Atari, meanwhile, was able to sell in stores like Sears, which gave them way more market availability. This availability gave them a strong first-place position in the market when the 2600 came around, and put the Odyssey 2, now owned by Philips, in a bad spot. They were trailing Atari by a lot, even losing out to Mattel's Intellivision console, and it was clear what they needed. They had the hardware to make it work, but what they needed was a killer app, a reason to go to that Magnavox store and get an Odyssey 2. And considering they called the second Odyssey the Odyssey 2, originality clearly wasn't at the forefront, so why not copy a few notes? Pac-Man came out in 1980, and all things considered, it did alright for itself. Pac-Man to many is the video game. When it released, it made waves like that of Pong and Space Invaders, only bigger. It was a real cross-media icon, and the companies who rode its coattails went all the way to the top. Midway had the pleasure of handling his American arcade release, while Atari would snap up the rights to make a home version. Now, the Otero County landfill doesn't need any more free advertising, so we'll steer clear of Atari's efforts. But right now, that's the most important thing to know. Atari had the full legal rights to publish a home port of Pac-Man. Philips knew Pac-Man could get people to buy the Odyssey too, but the problem was the rights for the home port now sat with a company they tried to run out of business. In walks KC Munchkin, and the side eyes it got from Atari could cut stone. The immediate thought upon seeing this game is to call it a blatant knockoff of Pac-Man, at least it was for Atari, but in reality, the game is mechanically unique from Pac-Man in a few key ways. Gameplay-wise, you were still eating dots in a maze while being chased by bad guys who you can in turn eat with a power-up, but the differences begin with the pellets themselves trying their damnedest to not be eaten. They'll move around the maze alongside KC and the Munchers in batches of 3, with their speed increasing whenever one gets eaten. The final pellet itself would even match KC's movement speed, meaning you had to strategize a lot more to cut it off. Mazes in KC are generally more unique compared to the Pac-Man mazes, having moving elements that cut off certain parts and require different routing, with some mazes having gimmicks like flickering off for a time to hide the maze's layout. And a key point that was made in the trial that followed, KC is blue. It's a game that clearly draws inspiration from Pac-Man, but feels like its own thing. Truly, if it had been released under different circumstances, I think it could have coexisted with Pac-Man rather than being seen as an imitation. Of course, this wasn't Philips stumbling into a hornet's nest by accident. They had told lead designer Ed Averitt that they wanted a game that, while not breaking any laws, would be similar to Pac-Man. In promotion for the game, Philips was incredibly insistent that Pac-Man never come up. Don't mention it, don't even imply it, don't show them side by side in marketing. Try to bury the lead as much as you can, or else Atari is gonna find out. Unfortunately, that wouldn't work, as once KC hit the streets, Atari was trying to hit it with their car. Critics called it the Odyssey's answer to Pac-Man, and the next in a long line of Pac-Man-style games. Couldn't you guys just call it the next Lock and Chase? Atari had finally had all it could take of Philips cutting in like this, and sued for copyright infringement on January 19th, 1982, to prohibit the sales of KC Munchkin. Believe it or not, Philips actually had the advantage going into this, as lawsuits with games had happened before, but rarely if ever did they involve how a game felt, or common ideas like running through a maze. This meant it wasn't a case about Philips trying to prove their game wasn't like Pac-Man, it was Atari trying to prove that it was. That was harder than anticipated because the courts focused more on the technical side of the game, looking through the code and development, rather than the more obvious stuff such as the structure of the game itself. Philips had anticipated and were relieved that this was the route taken, as they were unbeatable here. KC didn't use pre-existing Pac-Man code, and therefore was completely distinct from Pac-Man. The icing on the cake for them was hearing what a jury considered to be distinct features between the two games. Yeah, remember how I said KC is a different color from Pac-Man? That's an actual reason that Atari got for how KC was different from Pac-Man. He wasn't yellow. They also called the Munchers in KC scarier than the ghosts in Pac-Man, and these, alongside with the code differences, were enough for Philips to win the lawsuit. Atari, though, refused to take this lying down, and decided to appeal the decision, and in the appeal, they got a much different outcome. Here they decided to focus much more on the expression of the ideas in each game, with it being an applicable description of both to say they're about semicircle characters chasing dots around a maze while various ghoulish enemies pursue them, with the player able to reverse course and fight back after collecting a special item. Other games had Pac-Man's style of gameplay, but they all varied themselves thematically, be it turning Pac-Man into a car or a robber, and the ghosts into cops. Philips, though, couldn't convincingly say that how they described Pac-Man wasn't also a way to describe KC. The appeals court then ruled in Atari's favor, leaving out the lawsuit with the statement, the district court's conclusion that the two works are not substantially similar is clearly erroneous, and its refusal to issue a preliminary injunction constitutes an abuse of discretion. They didn't just leave it at that, though, also including a final portion going into how this case should not be taken as conclusive, as the nature of gaming as a burgeoning medium meant that it was subject to change as the industry changed. Since this is an interlocutory appeal, however, we are mindful that our holdings do not constitute a conclusive adjunction of the merits of the plaintiff's claim. The ordinary observer test should not be applied in a judicial vacuum. Further developments of the facts at the trial may command a different conclusion. Atari got what it wanted, and KC Munchkin was prohibited from being sold, with a bid to take this to the Supreme Court from Philips falling flat. This lawsuit would be pivotal in establishing how copyrighted material in video games worked, not just looking at the code aspect as though it were any other computer program, but also in how that code is expressed. through graphics and gameplay. Atari would go on to become a shambling zombie that is selling collections of 2600 games for the 80th time, while Philips left the gaming industry altogether after the CDI. Except, before saying goodbye to the whole Atari debacle, they did have one last handful of dirt to toss in Atari's eyes. See, KC couldn't be used in his game of origin, but there was nothing saying they couldn't use him, period. In came KC's Crazy Chase, a game that took the extra step from being distinct into legally distinct, as the Munchers were replaced with a single enemy. This enemy just so happened to look like a centipede, and now mushrooms would sprout up around the maze to get in KC's way. In a move petty enough to give Binding of Isaac Judas a run for its money, they designed a new KC game as they were battling the trial for the first one, and made the bad guy in it the Centipede from Atari's Centipede. For his part, Ed Averitt claims the game was not made as a jab at Atari, which proves that Ed Averitt is a goddamn liar. Without the Atari versus Philips case, it's hard to say how video game copyright would work now. But with this next lawsuit, we can be sure that without it, games would be much worse off, as if it had gone differently, we might not have fighting games. Fighting games as a genre really evolved into their base form with Karate Champion by Technos and Data East in 1984. If any fighting games you like have bonus rounds, special move inputs, or best 2 of 3 round systems, then it owes a debt of gratitude to Karate Champ. And the game's revision, Player vs. Player, would introduce competitive 2-player fights to the genre. I know this sounds like one of Jack's classic talking about bullshit nobody cares about, but I swear I have a point this time. Using the template set by Karate Champ, Capcom would release Street Fighter in 1987. This is all that will be said about Street Fighter 1. Street Fighter 2, meanwhile, shook the industry to its core, and single-handedly brought fighting games to the main stage. Revisions of Street Fighter 2 alone have sold over 15 million copies, and made billions of dollars for Capcom. With Capcom having planted the seeds for such a big success, other companies immediately began tilling the same soil to see what they could get out of it. For a long time, until the release of Mortal Kombat, every fighting game was desperate to become the next Street Fighter. And that influence is more than obvious in a lot of these games. Fightin' Spirit might not seem like it at first, what with the giant Komodo dragon fighter, but one look at the Arizona stage showcases what they took. Art of Fighting was so close to the original, down to having the exact same director, that Capcom eventually bit back and made Dan Hibiki to mock its 2 main characters, Robert and Ryo. However, some incredibly mean-spirited ribbing between enemies is one thing. Only one game ever got Capcom upset enough, they decided to take legal action. And surprisingly, it was pointed at Data East. Data East had started the 1v1 fighting game genre, and they'll be damned if they weren't gonna get some profit off the boom themselves. Only 2 years after the release of Street Fighter 2, they released Fighter's History, a story about various fighters from all over the world fighting in a tournament, with an evil magic man at the end. Only this time, instead of being a fuchsia Nazi with an identity crisis, it's Karnov. Hi, Karnov! Now, just like KC Munchkin, the game did have its own set of defining features in comparison to Street Fighter 2. Like the weak point system, which let you stun enemies by hitting particular body parts over and over again. However, for every one thing the game did different, there were about 5 things you could draw a connection to with Street Fighter. The main character is a karate man with a fireball, forward-moving special attack, and an uppercut. They have a blonde guy in green pants and army boots who does flash kicks and throws sonic booms, a Muay Thai guy with a cross-screen knee strike, the versus screen is almost the exact same as Street Fighter's, and most damningly, the health bars were the same color. The KC Munchkin precedent will be of no use to us now! The roster did have some unique picks, like more than one girl character, and the third gender, Evil Clown, but it was hard when all these similarities were stacked up next to each other to not look over to Street Fighter and think it was intentional. That's because it was entirely intentional. Capcom had tried to ignore Fighter's history, with the topic even repeatedly being brought up to Capcom president Kenzo Sugimoto, until they finally brought Data East to court and tried to get the game taken out of arcades and off the shelves. As a part of the evidence that intentional plagiarism was carried out, the design documents for Fighter's history were made available as evidence, and multiple references to Street Fighter II were made. Repeatedly, elements and characters from Street Fighter II were mentioned and used as sources of inspiration for the characters and mechanics of Fighter's history. Now, clearly this looks bad, but Data East had a plan to showcase that these two games were nothing alike. Like a mini-movie? This is the only reason I wanted to talk about video game lawsuits. In an attempt to drum up public support for Data East, they released a 30-minute long VHS tape where head of corporate liaisons, Esko Adelman, would compare and contrast elements from Fighter's history to Street Fighter II. It is a bizarre watch as you see her go beat by beat and dissect every difference between the characters in Street Fighter to Fighter's history, comparing designs and home stages to emphasize that they are nothing alike. This is on top of footage of them obviously doing sonic booms and Hadokens, but that's not important.
In this third segment, we review Capcom's assertion that Data East's character Makoto Mizoguchi is a copy of Capcom's character Ryu. Other than being male Japanese fighters using karate techniques, the two characters are not similar. This is the picture of Capcom's Ryu from the Street Fighter II strategy guide. Ryu wears a traditional Shotokan karate outfit, complete with a black belt and extended wrist protectors. This is the bitmap image of Ryu on his home stage, which is a dojo rooftop. This is a pencil sketch of Mizoguchi. This is the bitmap image of Mizoguchi in his ready stance. Mizoguchi departs from the traditional karate dress with baggy black pants and shortened wrist protectors. Mizoguchi's weak spot is his headband. Mizoguchi is a master of Kenka Karate, or no-hold-barred karate. It begins with standard karate and adds illegal fighting moves such as attacks below the belt, headbutting, and grabbing an opponent's collar to throw him to the ground. Mizoguchi's Japanese identification is further emphasized by his home stage, the suspension bridge between two steep mountains in the Kansai region of Japan. It looks very different from Ryu's home stage.
Now, this video did bring up an important idea that would eventually decide the lawsuit, but in the moment, it did look like Data East was in trouble, seeing as the judge had identified 3 characters and 28 moves as extremely similar to Street Fighters. That's when Data East presented a very important fact. They tried this before and it didn't work! Data East had unsuccessfully tried to sue Epic Games, not that one, for their Karate Champ knockoff World Karate Championship. The evidence was that they used their game's name in the name of their game. Like a reverse KC Munchkin, they had originally won the lawsuit, but after an appeal it was overturned, on the grounds that the elements that Data East claimed were copywritten were too generic in general to be owned by just one company. This is what I mentioned as being mentioned in the VHS tape. And from there, Data East pursued the angle that the elements Capcom alleged were stolen were actually something called scenes en faire, or in English, scenes to do. This is a principle in copyright law as it relates to genre, and the acknowledgement that a work in a certain genre has scenes or elements it's obligated to hit based on how the genre works. An example is in a romance movie. People expect a big meet-cute, some date scenes, a misunderstanding and breakup before a big emotional reconnection. No one can own the rights to any one of those individual elements because they're nebulous and sorta necessary for any piece in the genre. Apply that to a fighting game and you get much the same. Capcom can't claim ownership of elements like Karate Man, Hairy Wrestler, or Blonde American Man, or wider elements like a World Tournament format, special moves, or the concept of sub and main bosses at the end of an arcade mode. They also affirmed that should they rule in Capcom's favor, it would create a monopoly over the fighting game scene, as they would own such basic ideas that nobody else would be able to use them without going through Capcom. And when Capcom makes so many fighting games, they were unlikely to do that. In a world where Capcom wins this lawsuit, there's nothing stopping them from saying you can't have fireballs in your fighting games, or that you can't have a guy who practices karate. Data East winning this lawsuit ensured that fighting games would never be a Capcom-exclusive genre. And because of that, series like KOF, Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Guilty Gear, BlazBlue, and Mortal Kombat would all be allowed to exist. Would Capcom have ever enforced copyright like that? I don't know. But the point is they would have had the option to, which is scary enough. Now, the courts did also decide that Fighter's history is obviously trying to cash in on the Street Fighter II craze, but they also said that's not really illegal. You can't sue a spy movie because it came out after James Bond. Oh, and if you thought it ended there, SNK decided to get in and throw one last jab in at Capcom to get back for the whole Dan debacle. In the game King of Fighters Maximum Impact Regulation A, SNK made a deal with the parent company of Data East to include Mizoguchi, the main character of Fighter's history. Yeah, fuck you, Capcom! SNK wins again! Now, software is only half the game when it comes to games, as the hardware that makes games possible is just as important, as shown by the time a developer basically swindled their way onto a game console. Accolade was a company founded in 1984 by former employees of Activision who, as most people have at one point, hated Activision. They hadn't delisted Transformers Devastation yet though, so it's anyone's guess as to what their problem was. For a majority of their lives, they would publish games for computers like the Commodore 64. But in the late 80s, when the Genesis came out, the company saw promise in porting some of their games to the console to try to break into the home console market. Sega, though, had three big problems that came with trying to publish games for their consoles. First is that Sega required a massive licensing cost to publish games for the Genesis, with every individual cartridge published requiring an additional $10 to $15 to make. This isn't a Sega-exclusive practice, and in the time of proprietary cartridges like the NES cartridges, this sort of deal was common. But Sega's licensing cost wasn't to make the cartridge, you were paying those $10 to $15 to get to make the cartridge. Secondly, Sega had a notoriously hellish quality assurance team, often leaving games on for days, testing every aspect of them, and sometimes just smacking the console around to make sure the game wouldn't freeze. Not only could this process take weeks, but it was yet another costly price point for a developer who didn't even know if they wanted to stick with this model yet. Finally, and most damningly, Accolade would have to sign a contract to make Genesis the sole home for their games, making Sega their main publisher and prohibiting them from publishing on other consoles. This is a tactic Sega would pull with smaller developers and publishers, with the main exception to this procedure being either established developers like Capcom or licensed games like cartoons and sports games. Accolade saw this mounting amount of problems that came with working with Sega, and knowing Nintendo wouldn't be much better, decided to stick with the Genesis, while sticking it to Sega itself. They were gonna publish their games on the Genesis, whether Sega wanted them to or not. By taking 3 official Sega games, they decompiled their code and found what code was necessary to shut off the lockout program in the Genesis that disabled unofficial games from running. By taking that code and adding it to their games, they had suddenly cracked the Genesis and were able to sell their unofficial games on store shelves as though they were normal Sega games. The code that Accolade had copied, though, was copywritten by Sega. So by doing this, all of these games had legal bombs hidden inside of them that would soon detonate in a big way. Accolade tried to stem the coming storm by putting on the back of their game boxes that these games weren't associated with Sega, but regardless, Sega still noticed. At first, they didn't really do anything to stop Accolade, more so just watched on confused as they thought, what the hell are these guys doing? In response to their cracked games, Sega decided to add new code to future Genesis games and revisions of the Genesis to stop Accolade and their unlicensed games. This new tech in the Genesis would check for a specific line of code in the games, and if it was present, would show off a screen specifying that the game had been licensed by Sega. This was baked into the console itself, and not the cartridges. All that was on the cartridges was the line of code. This was put in as a way to make sure that if Accolade ever tried this again, they could get them on copyright infringement, as they had never been What? They already reverse engineered the code and added it to their games again? Well, goddamn, I guess we're going to court. On Halloween Day 1991, probably not in costume, Sega took Accolade to court in what seemed like an open and shut case. Accolade was faking having authentic Sega licensing, and were even putting it in their games, on top of using code that was copywritten and therefore owned by Sega. Accolade, meanwhile, was claiming that their use of Sega's code was fair use, and necessary to publish their games on the Genesis. The judge rather predictably ruled in favor of Sega and found Accolade at fault for their reverse engineering. Their games were removed from stores, and they were barred from publishing anymore. That is where you would think it would end. Except instead, what happened was Accolade appealed the decision, and suddenly the whole narrative shifted. The new judge found that Sega was actually limiting competition and creating a monopoly on the Genesis by including code that only they had the knowledge of to limit what games made it onto their console. All the code Accolade had taken from Sega was the header file that allowed them to bypass the license requirement. And where that file was 25 bytes, an average Accolade game was closer to 1.5 million bytes of data, making the header file barely a fraction of the game's code. Sega's lawyers, whose heads must have been spinning at this point, tried to argue that because Sega created the Genesis and the code used by Accolade, that Accolade couldn't profit off of work that Sega had done without paying their licenses. The jury, though, found they actually could do that, since the amount of effort that Sega put in didn't give them special treatment in regard to their copyright protection. In fact, the courts found that Accolade was actually in the right for doing what they did, saying where disassembly is the only way to gain access to the ideas and functional elements embodied in a copyrighted computer program, and where there is a legitimate reason for seeking such access, disassembly is a fair use of the copyrighted work, as a matter of law. Do you want to hear the craziest part of the entire trial? Sega was found at fault for putting in the lockout, because it caused Accolade to falsely label their games as being endorsed by Sega. The defense against this was Accolade saying, "We didn't want to put the message in there, but Sega made us." And that worked! The courts decided that by making it necessary for the Sega endorsement to appear for a Genesis game to run, they were the ones responsible for forcing companies like Accolade to create market confusion. Now, I might not be a big city lawyer, but this don't make a lick of goddamn sense. You made them break down your door. How else were they supposed to get to your valuables? Accolade would win the appeal, and now Sega was forced to settle with Accolade and bring them in as an official licensee, giving them a much different deal that allowed them to publish for multiple consoles, as well as being given lucrative development jobs like the prequel to Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, Charles Barkley's Shut Up and Jam. Of all the cases I looked at, this was definitely the strangest when it came to outcome. I thought for certain it would have been cut and dry that if Sega doesn't want Accolade games on their console, then they can't make them. That ended up not only not being the case, but irrelevant to the case as a whole, as the courts sided with Accolade in the end. This not only had a big effect on the copyright protection of decompiled software, eventually helping a PlayStation emulator named Connects beat Sony in a lawsuit and help establish the protection emulators are under to this day, but also had a knock-on effect that helped to ease licensing costs across the board. Now that Accolade had proven making unlicensed games was possible while using pre-existing code, it's likely companies would ease up on their restrictions to allow for more and discourage people from trying this sort of thing in the future. Given how all of these lawsuits are fairly old, the latest one being from 1991, you might assume that this is a practice that has gone out of style. But lawsuits regarding video games are very much still happening, and are getting dumber. For instance, this case in 2007 ended with a mass public execution. Now, longtime Jackalites will know I've discussed the sordid saga of Two Human like a decade ago, but the difference is that this time I'm actually gonna do a good job. Silicon Knights is a company that a lot of gamers are familiar with, but probably aren't familiar with just what a small lineup of games they really made. Only 9 published games across a 22-year history, but almost all of them come with a fascinating history. Be it the very first Legacy of Kain game they made for Crystal Dynamics, before suing them over alleged stolen story concepts for the game's sequel, Soul Reaver. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem being touted as one of the best and most unique games for the GameCube, a game that proved it wasn't the baby machine the PlayStation 2 made it seem. Or what about the Twin Snakes, which was a 3-way collab between them, Nintendo, and Konami to make the most, it's a little worse, remakes of all time. After that, it seemed like the team was set to be a second-party Nintendo powerhouse, stating they felt that Silicon Knights was less a company working for Nintendo and more a company working within Nintendo. This lasted 1 year before they left Nintendo to shack up with Microsoft. What are we doing wrong? Now that the team had a bit more elbow room to work with, they decided that the game to make with all these new resources was Two Human, a game whose development stretched all the way back to 1999 on the original PlayStation. The game that would have come out if it was completed back then is unrecognizable from the game we have now, being closer to cyberpunk than anything else. The game would briefly restart development on the GameCube during the Nintendo days, but this was ultimately not how the game would be made. Nope, only Microsoft could give them the budget they would need to make the game. You know what, screw it, we got PowerPoint money! 3 games! The game went from a 4-disc PlayStation game to a 3-installment Xbox game. And with a $100 million budget, it was looking pretty likely that we were gonna get all 3. Now, the development of and release of Two Human were both disasters, but not much of it is worth bringing up in regards to the following lawsuit. Jurors are usually unsympathetic to stiff animations and poor weapon variety. See, the 6th generation of consoles is where developers went to die. They would enter rosy cheeks and ready to make a new Bomberman game, and leave with the shirt they came in with and not much else. Developing for the 360 and PlayStation 3 was hard and expensive, especially so when it came to the engine. Developers were scrambling to find out what they could realistically make and fit onto this machine, and many struggled. This saw the rise of licensed engines, ones that developers would release with the intent of making them publicly available for other developers to license. The most popular of the time was no doubt Unreal Engine, developed by Epic Games. Yes, that one. And in order to build Two Human, they would license the Unreal Engine and get to work. Get to work suing Epic, that is. Silicon Knights claimed that Epic wasn't properly supporting the Unreal Engine, and purposefully releasing poorer builds to licensees than the builds they kept for themselves to build the upcoming Gears of War. They claimed this practice was negatively impacting both the development and public perception of Two Human, and that caused them to lose a lot of money. Epic decided to countersue considering Silicon Knights was lying about most of this, and the fact it was only natural that a continuously supported engine would first be applied to a studio's own in-house projects. Worse yet, they then alleged that Silicon Knights had stolen Epic's Unreal code to implement into their new in-house engine they were building to make Two Human. Funny thing to note is that all of this went down in 2007, while Two Human wouldn't be released for another year in 2008. So now instead of a normal, lukewarm press cycle, the discussion surrounding the game was, Silicon Knights says new Silicon Knights game is so bad, they're going to sue people over it. Silicon Knights couldn't pull off the same legal magic that Accolade could, as when the code for the Unreal Engine and Silicon Knights engine were put side by side, thousands of lines of code were found to be identical, and were poorly disguised as to look original. Making things even worse was that part of those copies included personal notes left by Epic Games developers, which contained confidential trade secrets Silicon Knights obviously wouldn't have had any access to unless they ripped apart the Unreal Engine. Silicon Knights was left without a pot to piss in or a window to toss it out of, and were forced to not just recall and cancel, but destroy the code they stole and the games that used the fraudulent engine, which included 2 Human and the more recent X-Men Destiny. Their name had become mud following the controversy, and after having to pay out $4.5 million to Epic, they folded in 2014. Of all the lawsuits, this one has to be the most catastrophic simply because not only did it kill Silicon Knights, but it was their own lawsuit that did it. They probably would have been found out for the engine theft sooner rather than later, but it was them needling Epic about it that really sped up the process. As for 2 Human, the game has since been re-released as a free download on the Microsoft Store for both 360 and Xbox One. Because who cares at this point? You know, like, who's gonna stop them? Now, they've come up a few different times during this talk, but when I say lawsuit, your mind auto-completes Nintendo. No other company in gaming is as infamous for their lawsuits as Nintendo. They'll go after anyone for any reason. And the threat of a lawsuit from Nintendo, which they almost always win, is enough to put the fear of God in most people. Going over the history of every Nintendo lawsuit would not only take forever, but have massive dry spells between your Pal Worlds and Mario Kart. So I picked 3 of the ones I thought were the most interesting. Early Nintendo dealt with its fair share of lawsuits on either side. From their lawsuit with Universal over Donkey Kong being a ripoff of King Kong, to challenging Magnavox over a patent for the technology used to display game graphics on color TVs. In the time when Nintendo was establishing itself as a market leader, people were testing the limits of what they could get away with. And the frontrunner in pushing the envelope was Tengen, a subsidiary of Atari. Tengen, which gets its name from the same board game Atari did, Go, was looking to storm the NES with as many games as possible. Except part of Nintendo's licensing agreement for third parties limited them to only 5 releases a year, meaning they were limited in how much they could make. But this was Atari. If you remember back, they had the rights to publish Pac-Man. That should have been enough for anybody. Well, it was good, but they wanted more. But that pesky license they were under stopped them. That's when they stole an idea from Accolade and decided to go unlicensed. Only problem was, the NES had a lockout chip called the 10ES, which stopped unlicensed games. Well, no problem. They could reverse engineer the code like Accolade would in the future, right? No, they couldn't crack the code using pre-existing games quick enough, and so hatched a plan to crack the code in a different way. Tengen's lawyers contacted the US Patent Office and told them they had plans to sue Nintendo. In order to properly proceed with the litigation, they would need a copy of the 10ES to use as evidence. The Patent Office complied and sent Tengen the part so they could use it in the lawsuit. Except, Tengen never planned on suing Nintendo. Instead, they lied about a lawsuit so they could get a copy of the 10ES, reverse engineer how it worked, and then use that to bypass the real thing using their new chip, the Rabbit. Nintendo obviously wasn't happy with what Tengen was doing, but they got even more upset when they found out Tengen would be suing them for trying to create a market monopoly. Nintendo would countersue Tengen on the grounds of how they made a majority of their cartridges, using fraudulently gotten information and stolen tech. Considering how the earlier Accolade example went, you might assume that Tengen won this lawsuit, considering the fact that it was later found that decompiling software was protected by fair use. Well, it would've worked that way for Tengen, if they didn't get the chip by lying to the patent office. That's when they officially overstepped legal boundaries and got Tengen in trouble. Tengen was found guilty and forced to stop production on their unofficial NES cartridges. In 1994, too little too late unfortunately, as the SNES had been released, and they didn't really need to make NES carts anymore anyway. From a lawsuit where it could have been said that Nintendo had the moral high ground, to one made out of entirely greed and spite, we go now to when Nintendo really just wanted to find an excuse to punch Blockbuster in the mouth. As a new part of the pop culture landscape, video games were going to be up for rental in the same way a book or a movie could be. And when it came to renting movies in the 90s, nobody beat Blockbuster. The decision to stock video games for rental alongside movies was an obvious one, and it's one that gave Blockbuster a huge boost, and one that gave Nintendo a huge headache. They don't see any of the profits generated from a rental of their game. They would only get money when Blockbuster initially purchased their copy. That meant a not insignificant part of their player base would get their games for what to Nintendo was free. Nintendo was looking for any way to get Blockbuster to stop, at first attacking the whole concept of rentals of video games altogether. That didn't get very far though, as Blockbuster was protected by something called the First Sale Act. This act meant that anybody is free to sell or rent any piece of copywritten material, so long as they legally purchased it in the first place. Nintendo was locked in a real pickle with this one, since they wanted to kill Blockbuster, real bad, but needed a reason. Blockbuster wasn't breaking any laws, they hadn't reproduced any of their material illegally, Wait a minute, that's it! Blockbuster has been illegally reproducing Nintendo-made material without their permission and selling it for a profit. No, not the games, the manuals. See, people are clumsy and stupid. They're going to either lose, ruin, or just keep the manuals of the games they rent from Blockbuster. Blockbuster wasn't going to rent out a copy of a game without everything it originally came with, so to get around this, Blockbuster would photocopy the original manuals and include them with rented copies of the games whose manuals had been lost. Nintendo keyed in on this, the reproduction of a separate copyrighted work that they had produced without their permission for profit, and made this the focal point of their lawsuit. Unlike the video games themselves, these weren't covered under the First Protection Act, considering they were reproductions, and therefore not gotten legally. The courts ruled in favor of Nintendo, at which point Blockbuster threw up its hands and said, "Fucking fine!" They would now contact Nintendo directly whenever they needed reproductions of a manual, and would pay for them to make it rather than making a photocopy themselves. From a business sense, it does make sense to try to quash an industry like this that actively profits off not giving you profits. On a personal note, come the fuck on. When it comes to Nintendo lawsuits, this has to be as petty as it gets. Going after manuals, of all things, just to try to get Blockbuster to stop stocking games. The media of the time was also largely on Nintendo's side, with David Sheff, author of the book Game Over, calling for a period similar to when movies release in theaters before coming to rental stores like Blockbuster. What the hell are you talking about? A movie isn't a video game. You don't go to a theater to play a video game. Why should I have to wait 5 months before getting to rent a game to see if I like it? This is up there as one of the least defendable Nintendo lawsuits in my eyes. It's just so blatant in its cash-grabbing ways. For a similarly petty lawsuit, with a different outcome altogether though, we're gonna have to go back a hair to 1992. This is the story of how being kinda rude to one guy can cost you $15 million. David Daring was the CEO of the UK-based developer Codemasters, a studio that those in the UK would probably know for a hell of a lot more than we know them for in the States. David was looking to strike up a deal with Nintendo to become a licensed publisher by talking to some representatives of Nintendo at a trade show in Las Vegas, Nevada. The representatives, however, said they would have rather talked in an official meeting and refused to talk to David on the show floor. The boil David's blood came to following a response like this could have melted through his bones, and his salt content shot through the roof. David decided then and there that he would do everything he could to begin production on his own official, unofficial NES dev kit. something that he and Codemasters could use to publish their own unofficial NES games. See, Tengen, that's how you do it! This started as simply porting Codemaster games to the NES without Nintendo's approval. But it was Dizzy's Treasure Island that presented the company's next big move, as they originally planned for the cartridge to have a knob on it that you could adjust to start the game with a certain amount of lives. While that feature would end up getting cut, the idea to be able to influence a game's features with an outside device stuck with Codemasters, and they decided to pursue it further. They eventually created a device that you could latch onto an NES cartridge that, in combination with a set of codes, could alter the data of a game and replace it with a new injected code, altering elements in the game into something new, like making the player invincible or giving them infinite lives. This was the Game Genie, marketed as a video game enhancer that could breathe new life into games you had already mastered. Start Mario 3 with power-ups, play Zelda with unlimited bombs, beat Battletoads, this thing was pretty much magic. Black magic, Nintendo said, burn the witch! Except Codemasters and American distributors Galoob were so sure Nintendo was going to sue them, they actually sued Nintendo first in an attempt to get them to confirm or deny that the Game Genie was legal. Nintendo took the bait and sued Galoob for what they called a violation of their intellectual properties, calling the states that games would be in post-Game Genie new games, and claiming that because of that, they were illegally making derivative works based on Nintendo's copywritten material. Nintendo was also able to get an injunction put on the sales of the Game Genie, freezing them until the end of the trial. But that was about the last win they got in this case. Nintendo's argument would have held water, similarly to a case where Midway managed to sue the makers of a peripheral that sped up the arcade game Galaxian. But Galoob and Codemaster's method of changing the game changed the game. Codemaster in Galoob's case was also helped majorly by the fact that the Game Genie didn't permanently change the cartridges. As soon as the NES was turned off, the cheats went away, and it was the same as when it was purchased. The judge for the case ultimately made the comparison that what Galoob and Codemasters were doing wasn't dissimilar to taking a pencil, scribbling out words in a book, and then erasing it before you put it back on the shelf. The consumers had already bought the game. They were free to alter the code from that point forward however they wanted, as long as they didn't try to sell it as a new thing afterwards. Nintendo lost over $15 million trying to kill the Game Genie, and in the end were left with nothing. Nothing except a massive wound for Sega to pour salt onto by then releasing an official Sega Genesis Game Genie in 1994. And all of this was because one guy was really pissed off that he couldn't show people his egg.